Welcome to Forbidden Knowledge, a video series analyzing the mechanics of individual scenarios of Arkham Horror, the card game. My name is Tim, and this is the third and final episode of the first season. Today we take a closer look at the Devourer Below, which seems to be the least favorite scenario of the fanbase. As always, there is an explicit spoiler warning. This video series addresses all topics normally considered forbidden. Okay? So, this episode has more or less 3 chapters. Chapter 1: Why is the Devourer Below so awful? I showed you a ranking of the scenarios last time, and just last week Miskatonic University Radio did a new ranking of all 52 scenarios released so far for Arkham 2020. The Devourer Below came in last, while Midnight Masks scored pretty good. I think there are 3 layers that contribute to that feeling of a not so good scenario, which are its uninteresting and insubstantial map, too many and too strong enemies, and an overall disjointed structure. I will have a look on all 3 of these topics and compare that to the Return to version to see how some of those issues got addressed. In Chapter 2, I will look at some cards of this and the previous scenario more closely. Although I said that The Gathering is the tutorial of Arkham Horror the card game, there is so much more the whole core set campaign is teaching about. This affects some tactical decisions, or rather the necessity of mastering different tactics. And I claim this even teaches morality. And morality leads directly to Chapter 3, in which I try to wrap up the whole Night of the Zealot campaign by answering 2 questions. What is the ideal strategy to go through this campaign? And why isn't the Devourer Below awful at all? But before being too controversial or even constructive, let's have a look what there is not to like about this scenario. First, the map layout. You start at a location, the main path, which is connected to 4 other woods locations. These are chosen randomly and reflect your searching through the woods for the ritual site. But there is no true feeling of hiking through the forest like in, let's say, the Untamed Wilds. Bad example, that is by itself one of the least liked scenarios. But you just don't go deeper and deeper into the woods, but have to return to the main path after investigating each location. Sometimes those locations are indeed connected, but you realize that only after revealing the second location, or even a third location connecting 2 others. That is not bad by itself, but in connection with returning to the main path all the time, it feels random and counterintuitive. Eventually, you figure out where the ritual is held, and you are right, it's just next to the main path. This map is like a 5-pointed star, so no topographical progress while investigating the woods, just going forward and back all the time. But if you look at all available woods locations, you can see that the woods are not so structureless as they might seem. All 6 locations form a ring, which should be around the central path, or rather a central clearing or something. And after a while, you figure out where the ritual site might be. The impression of an irritating and unconnected map comes just from picking only some parts of that circle and placing these randomly on the table. This results in 15 different versions of the map structurally, but countless ways of setting those up, as there is no concise layout beneath. I could imagine a version of that map, a little bit like Blood on the Altar versus Carnival of Horrors, in which there are 6 locations around the main path, all connected to the main path and to those next to them. And one of those is the ritual site. But that's not what it is it? So, what did the Return to version do to address this? Well, it does make it worse by adding 4 new locations. What was great in Midnight Masks and even The Gathering, but it does not much good in this case, as the new locations are just connected to one another It is even more unlikely to find connections between some of them, and the new locations are not much fun either, but more of that later. This results in 210 different setups for the map, which is obviously more variety, but sadly not much more fun at the same time. Let's look at my second complaint: too strong enemies. There are a lot of enemies showing up in this scenario, but let's focus on the main baddie first, the Devourer Below himself, Umordoth. He is a 5 fight, 6 evade enemy. He is a hunter and massive, and he damaged your health and sanity by 3 each. This is so much worse than everything you saw before in this game. But maybe you still hold on some dynamite or shriveling. You could try. And then you realize that Umordoth has not just the massive trait, but also a massive amount of health, with a basis of 6 and 4 more health per investigator. Sure, it is possible to kill him, maybe even with just the cards of the core set, but it feels impossible and pretty unfun. We like to win, don't we? Before we look at what the Return to version did about that issue, let's have a look at my third and final complaint: the disjointed structure of the Act and Agenda decks. The 3 acts are very straightforward and linear. Find some clues in random woods locations and figure out where the ritual site is. Get there and then investigate that to stop whatever there's going on. Seems easy enough. The agenda is also very straightforward and linear. There are doom thresholds and it happens something bad after meeting those. Advancing Agenda 1 spawns an enemy. After Agenda 2 you'll get a new basic weakness. This might not be as bad as it sounds, but again it feels pretty cruel, doesn't it? But what did you expect from the Agenda deck besides cruelties? The awkward thing is that the Act deck is actually worse. Completing Act 1 puts not just the ritual side into play, but also an enemy. Well, it's actually not one enemy, it's the remaining members of the Cult of Umordoth, so potentially 7 enemies at once. You are getting punished for your investigation. It is fair that you meet them again if you don't manage to kill or interrogate them in the previous scenarios, but that they are put in play by your investigation feels unrewarding, at least. Of course, the last act isn't so simple, and shouldn't be. You have to perform a successful skill test to put a clue on the agenda to meet your objective. And then there is another enemy or 2 in higher player counts. And if you can overcome all those perils, you win the campaign. Congratulations. Of course, if all this is too hard for you, you can always flee. This might be a sane decision, but it leads to the downfall of Arkham and you losing the campaign, so don't play safe. But what happens when the doom threshold on the last agenda is met? Well, something rather interesting. The backside of Agenda 3 is a new Act and Agenda card at the same time, replacing those in play. That means you can't stop the ritual anymore. It's obviously too late for that. This Act and Agenda also puts into play the ritual side, if you haven't found it yet, and the final boss Umordoth, which tries to kill you. This would lead to Resolution 0. But don't be afraid, there are ways to confront him. You could obviously kill him, that's hard, but possible, and if you do, you win the campaign. But I guess most players died trying. Then there is a second option. You could sacrifice your body lead to Chandler. But isn't that a bitch move? It surely is. But being a bitch was another way to end this scenario, and I claim that most players did so. Am I wrong? I really like the idea of the endgame, but now you can clearly see the 3 big issues of this structure. First, investigating or rather advancing the agenda feels more punishing than rewarding. Second, there is no interaction between the Act and Agenda deck. What you are doing and what the cult does is totally disjointed. Third, your investigation is actually pointless because the final act and agenda also puts the ritual side into play. No more need for searching that place. And such, no need to fight that bunch of cultists. Players realized that there is an optimal strategy here. Or should I say a cheesy one? Just do nothing. Stand on the main path, equip and prepare yourself for battle, and after Agenda 3 advances, just kill that beast. Or if you couldn't do that, sacrifice Lita. I think it's fair to say that this is a design flaw. So, what does the return to version do to change that? Well, nothing it seems. There is no alteration of one of those decks at all. But actually they fixed it, just in another place, the boss fight itself. Remember this guy? He's tough, I complained about that. The solution? Let's make him even tougher. The return to version attached this card to Mordoth, Vault of Earthly Demise. When Mordoth comes into play, you are forced to put a resource on this card and another resource for every act card in play. These resources buff his fight value from 5 to 7, 8 or even 9. Now we're talking. But that's not all. For each resource he gets 1 more health per investigator. So Mordoth could have as much as 38 health in a 4-player game. Isn't that great? Wait, I was complaining before that he is too hard to fight, and now I say that's great? I do indeed. Here's why. The original Mordoth surely was hard to fight, but it was still possible to defeat him. I am confident that it is nearly impossible to defeat this version of him. This tells us, the players, 2 things. Confronting an ancient one with brutal force is not the best idea. You shouldn't do this. And try to find another way to save the world. Besides this bluntly educational twist, this also fixes the disconnection of the Act and Agenda decks, as your progress now has purpose. By fulfilling your objectives, you are weakening this guy. Not to the degree of the original version, but still. After completing Act 2, you could be confronted by this very powerful enemy, but maybe there's a slight chance to defeat him. And if you are able to complete Act 3, there will be no fight at all and you win this campaign. And I think all that teaches us that it is indeed expected to prevent the ritual by advancing the Act deck. And in the case of the Agenda deck running out, you already have failed. Within your failure, you still can win the campaign, but just through a battle you are not supposed to win. Or you could perform the bitch move. But sacrificing Lita is actually no win. Here is what the campaign guide has to say about that strategy. The guilt over sacrificing Lita forever haunts your memory. Each investigator must search the collection for a random madness weakness and add it to his or her deck. The investigators have survived, but their actions weigh heavily on their consciences. See, that's no win. You just survived. When talking about the Gathering in my first episode, I said that it is the tutorial of Arkham Horror LCG. But I think it's more true to say that it is the part of the tutorial which teaches you the basics. Midnight Masks and Devourer Below are still the tutorial, but teaching you more abstract underlying concepts of the game. Like, there are enemies you are not considered to fight, or trying to save the world is a hard task, you might fail. Both scenarios also teach you that the basics are not set in stone, but can and will be altered. Let's look at some cards together. First, the woods locations. 3 out of the original 6 are not investigated by using intellect, but by willpower, agility, or strength. All of these are explained within the flavor text. Of course you need willpower to investigate an old house with blood and bones scattered everywhere, just as you need agility to climb a cliff or strength to clear an overgrown path. This also gives low intellect investigators a chance to contribute something to the investigation. Then there is this location, Twisting Path. Here you need intellect to escape from this location. making it a real pain for the fighters of the group. The other original and the return to locations have special rules. Too bad they are all punishing, making the woods a very unpleasant place. And then there is this quiet glade, which looks nice, but is actually the worst. Sure, you can use the action ability of this to heal some of your wounds, but there are no clues in this place. That means you just wasted 2 precious move actions and have to visit all 3 of the other locations in play to advance the first act. Anyhow, these locations show you that investigating is not always just a simple intellect test and sometimes not even an intellect test at all. At Midnight Masks teaches you the same thing about fighting enemies, which does not have to be a series of strength tests. Wolfman Drew, of course, is a madman. He will attack you and you have to fight him. But all of the other 4 original members have an alternative way to deal with them. Those ways may be less efficient in some cases, but they also offer possibilities for non-fighting investigators, or to save some precious ammo. And you also learn something about their character and motivation. Peter Warren, for example, may be not a bad person at all. He's just a researcher of the occult. If you give him some insight by spending 2 clues, he leaves you alone and stops whatever he does in this cult. Victoria Devourer is a similar case. She is a collector of curiosities. Give her something of value and she is gone for good. The new cultists continue with this concept. Billy Cooper, as a cop one of the tougher cultists to fight, can be debunked by defeating a monster enemy at his location, showing each and every one that the theory of animals causing the deaths around Arkham is false. And then there is my favorite, Jeremiah Pierce, your neighbor. He is as easy to convince that the cult is bad as it gets. Just talk to him, he's a reasonable guy. But if your willpower is not as high as it should be, the realization that your friendly neighbor is one of the cultists might stress you quite a bit, resulting in up to 4 doom to put on the agenda. And that is the worst that could happen. But keep in mind, it's not the cultist who does this, it's your lack of willpower. After getting to know the character and motivation of the individual cultists, you might still come to the conclusion to oppose them. They are doing things that we can't ignore or appreciate. But they aren't soulless bad guys just for the reason of. They are human beings with a motivation. And here comes into play what I like to call morality. This concept might leave the realm of a card game and reach into role-playing, but still, is it really necessary to go on a killing spree through Arkham? Who are you to decide who shall live or die? Would you not become a murderer yourself? Let's keep that concept of morality in mind while wrapping up the campaign. This sketch I made to discuss the different endings of The Gathering. It shows that there are 3 distinct positive outcomes. One in which the Ghoul Priest is alive, you team up with Lita and your house is intact. If you manage to defeat the Ghoul Priest, you have to decide between Lita or your house. Which way is the best? And what does best mean? Most efficient? In the Midnight Masks, there are 128 possible outcomes, but they can all be described in pretty much the same way. You dealt with some cultists in one way or another. And the Devourer Below asks you to stop a ritual from happening, and if you do so, you win. If you are not able to stop the ritual, you either have to sacrifice Lita, an option you only have if she is your ally, or have to kill that Ancient One. But most likely you are going to die. So how are players going to face this challenge? It's obvious that most of us tried to kill the Ghoul Priest in the first scenario. Most games have trained us that way. The second decision is not as obvious as the first. Will you burn down the house or not? I would say no, but after you learn that you will get an ally for doing so, the gamer instincts might change that. In Midnight Masks, you do your best finding most of the cultists, probably kill them, but who knows. And in Devourer Below, you might try to stop the ritual, but that's hard, isn't it? So you will most probably face Mordor and try to find him. That might be too difficult, and instead of dying, you will probably sacrifice poor Lita. But if you are confident that it is possible to defeat Mordor, you also might decide to keep the house intact in the first place and never team up with Lita. This is the most straightforward way to play the Knight of the Zealot. This is the way countless other games have taught us to approach a challenge, and it works just fine in Arkham Horror, the card game. But there is another layer to this game. Let's start all over again. I argued that it might be the optimal way to flee and not kill the Ghoul Priest. Of course, he will eventually come back, but you keep your house intact and team up with that strange woman. And it is also the sanest thing to do. The designers do have the same opinion, by the way, because remember, burning down your house results in mental trauma. In the following scenario, you will have to fight the Masked Hunter and probably the Ghoul Priest too. But I think you should parley as much as you can with the other cultists, and only fight if necessary, like in the case of Wolfman Drew. But remember, with the Return to version, there might be a cult without him, so parleying is a reasonable thing to do. Your main goal should be to stop the ritual from happening, and if you fail, well, Lita has to die. And yes, this action is justified, as Lita is the one who escalated the whole situation in the first place. The ghouls and the cult have been in Arkham for a very long time, acting in secrecy, just feeding on corpses. Lita was the one entering and destroying the ghouls' lair, and so starting the night's events. Maybe you shouldn't push her, but she should surrender and express her repentance. This is, at least in my opinion, the most reasonable way to approach the Knight of the Zealot. And if you try to be a being of extreme morality, you might even change some nuances. The Ghoul Priest has to die. He attacked you first, that's fine. But by defeating him, you can avoid making yourself friends with the Zealot herself, and you keep your home. After that, try to calm the cult and stop the waking of Mordor. Of course, if you fail, there is no easy way out anymore. But being moral does not equal being easy, does it? The true quality of Arkham Horror, the card game, is that you have very different ways to deal with its challenges, and that the designers did their best to reward you for thinking out of the box. It's obvious that I like this game a lot, and I also still do like the Knight of the Zealot campaign. But here's why. After all this analyzing of the first campaign, I think that the Devourer Below isn't awful, but a very good scenario. It might be too hard, and because of that even frustrating. But being so, it should motivate you to try a different approach. Mordor is not just a tough enemy. He isn't too hard. He is a quasi undefeatable enemy, and as such was way too easy in the original version, giving you the impression you could and should defeat him. But that's not the case. With making him harder, this gets more and more obvious. And it also connects the act and agenda decks. Now your actions do matter, and it isn't the best strategy to just wait for the monster to appear. No, you try hard to avoid that, and face a probably dark fate if you can't. This otherworldly entity is the motivation to perform as good as you possibly can, even in the Gathering and the Midnight Masks. And to achieve that, it has to be hard, even too hard. And this is the true achievement of the Devourer Below. It has to be hard, even frustrating, to be good. Well, the map is still crap. And that's it. This was the last episode of the first season of Forbidden Knowledge. At first I thought there isn't much left I could learn about the Corset campaign, and yes, there are not many fundamentally new things I talked about in these 3 episodes, but still, looking at the structure and the mechanics of these scenarios shifted at least my perspective a lot. and I am eager to learn more and to search for the forbidden knowledge of the many other scenarios of Arkham Horror, the card game. But what about you? Did you enjoy the first season? Have you learned something? Has your perspective shifted? I would be so glad to get some feedback. Should I continue this series? And if so, what could be changed? What kind of forbidden knowledge would you like me to investigate? For now, I can just say thank you for watching and goodbye. And maybe see you soon, fellow investigators.